Good morning. My name is Loretta Pete Lambert, and I'm the chair of the First Nations University of Canada Board of Governors. Welcome everyone to the first annual We Rise Conference. The We Rise Conference vision aligns with the First Nations University of Canada's support of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, calls for action, the National Inquiry of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This morning I am honored to introduce the first keynote speaker, Judge David Arnot. Judge Arnot was appointed Chief Commissioner for the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission in 2009. After a decade of service as Treaty Commissioner for the province of Saskatchewan, he is known for introducing the term "we are all treaty people" in 2002. This phrase was done with the guidance of elders, and he has been widely recognized for his efforts to incorporate treaty education into the provincial education system. Judge Arnot's work in teaching treaties in the classroom project was specifically cited as a model for Canada by the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Racism in his report produced in March 2014. With that, I welcome Judge David Arnot.
Well, good morning. I join our host, Erica Bowden, and Chief Bobby Cameron, Chief Connie Big Eagle, Chief Marianne Daywalker-Pelche, in recognizing the Treaty Tories and the homelands of the Métis. For those of you who are attending this virtual conference from Saskatchewan, Canada, or elsewhere in the world, today I join this important event from Treaty 6 territory. Treaty 6 was entered into just a few miles north of here at Fort Carlton in August 1876, and a few miles to the west at Fort Pitt a month later in September 1876. Well, here at the beautiful Tatanka Room at Wanuskewin, today the sun is shining, the grass is growing, and the rivers is flowing. And that's the way it should be in treaty territory. My name is David Arnot. I'm the Chief Commissioner at the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission. I commend the Saskatchewan First Nations Women's Commission for launching the We Rise initiative with a goal of advancing a regional action plan for change. Thank you for demonstrating courage and leadership. I believe you are well placed to take this important initiative to advance, to promote, and to call for justice. Your voices are indeed powerful and important. You are reclaiming your power and place. I commend you for bringing so many parties to this discussion, to this table. I have great respect for First Nations leadership. I have profound respect for First Nations women's elders who have taught me so much. I have tremendous respect for your work. You advocate for the needs and rights of First Nations women and children. And I know you have strong advocates and allies with you here today. I'm pleased to acknowledge fellow Saskatchewan Human Rights Commissioner Colleen Cameron and Treaty Commissioner Mary Culbertson. I acknowledge Kylie Head, the Assistant Deputy Minister of Justice for Saskatchewan. I know she hopes to work in cooperation and collaboration with you. She is tasked with developing an action plan for the Government of Saskatchewan to follow in the collective effort to end harm and murder of Indigenous women and children. My hope is that you will help her in her work to create an action plan that will make a real difference, a plan that will meet the challenges. She's sincere in her goal to make Saskatchewan a safe place for Indigenous women and girls. The people here have come together to work and fight for the safety of Indigenous women and girls. This conference is a necessary and critical step forward. You are grappling with the most egregious breach of human rights in Saskatchewan. Discriminatory treatment based on race, gender, and poverty intersect. In Canada, children are taught at a young age that it is up to women and girls to protect themselves, and that it is their fault if they are harmed, injured by others, or murdered. Women are made responsible for the prevention of their own abuse. This cultural reinforcement deflects the accountability from men to women. Male violence becomes a woman's issue. Women and girls are not responsible for men's violence. It is fundamentally wrong to victim blame. We also need to recognize the harm, the pain, and the loss at the inquiry to missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls. Fortunately, it was channeled into the restorative tools in the calls for justice. The pain captured in the TRC process was channeled into powerful calls for action. We will not be anywhere in dealing with this pain, this harm, this loss, as long as hurting or murdering women is seen as okay or someone else's problem. As long as it's okay to ignore the TRC's call to action or the inquiry's call for justice, things won't change. During this conference, I expect that other presenters will offer well-thought and necessary ways to act on the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women's National Inquiry report and the TRC report. I'm here to talk about human rights. So my goal today is to provide a human rights perspective. It is my hope that I can offer an additional useful and valuable pathway, a pathway that will strengthen and support other courses of action. In the work that we can do and what I can offer is a human rights path. I believe a human rights lens can be a conduit to address the critical issues facing First Nations and Indigenous peoples, including particularly women and girls. Now let me be clear this morning, I speak openly and with humility, acknowledging that as much as I may be able to share with you, I have much to learn. Before I move on, I'd like to tell you an experience of mine. I learned a lot about humility, and I learned a lot about the strength and resilience of First Nations women from this story. It's a funny story in a way. I was Treaty Commissioner in Saskatchewan for 10 years, and I met a wonderful elder, Elder Alma Kaitwahat. She was the in-house elder at the Office of the Treaty Commissioner. She was small in stature, but a very powerful person and a tremendous educator. She loved to joke, and she loved to tease, and she loved to laugh. So one day, she was conducting a pipe ceremony at the Office of the Treaty Commissioner Learning Center that was for a large group of women, both First Nations and non-First Nations. My wife was one of the people in the circle, and she reminds me of this story often. So Alma invited me into the circle, and I stayed for a while, and I listened to her introduction. Then all of a sudden she stopped and she looked directly at me, and in a very commanding voice she said, "David, you must leave now." And I started to get up, and then she said, "Because you are weak." And all the women laughed. And Alma said, "Well, not you personally. All men are weak." And the women laughed even louder. So I left the room, I closed the door, and Alma said something else. I didn't quite hear what it was, but the women laughed in an uproar. So that was a humiliation for me in some ways, but it was a learning point. And I mention this story because we will not be able to change the status quo without Indigenous women being involved at the table in a respectful way. We will not be able to create change without recognizing the power and the resilience of Indigenous women and girls. Everyone needs to be involved. Together, I believe we can make a difference. Together, we can bring an end to the hurting, harming, and murder of women and girls. Together, we can act on the calls for justice. Well, how can we do that? Allow me to frame the pathway in this context, the context of three interconnected ideas: hope, education, and change. Starting with hope. Sustaining hope in the face of adversity and oppression is no small feat. Making change often requires sustained and substantial work. Aside from sheer effort, one thing that both hope and change have in common is they're both made possible by education. Education creates understanding, knowledge, and confidence. These three things are the foundation of hope. Hope is essential for change. From the time I was treaty commissioner, I've mentioned and maintained often in public settings, many presentations, that there is hope. Hope for a better future, hope for a better partnership, hope for a better relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. I firmly believe that. I believe today there are even more reasons to be hopeful. I'm hopeful because of the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'm hopeful because of the work done at the National Inquiry into Missing, Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. 8 years ago, in March of 2013, the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission, the FSIN, and the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan made a joint public call for a national inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We jointly asked the Government of Canada to work in partnership with Indigenous peoples and organizations to develop and implement a national action plan focused on root causes. We were the first provincial human rights commission in Canada to do so, but we were certainly not the only voice. There were many leaders, many individuals, many families who'd experienced loss who led that call. I'm hopeful because these voices and people like you who value education, who are here to learn, who are calling for a fair, equitable, and just future for Indigenous women and girls. Education. Prior to my appointment at the Human Rights Commission, I was a provincial court judge. In 1991, I'd been sitting as a judge for a decade. I was sitting in a small city that was surrounded by 7 First Nations, all within a 50-kilometer radius. The door of the courtroom would open every day and a sea of Indigenous people would flood in and day out. Something was very wrong with this picture. There was something happening in my community that I didn't fully understand. In my city, I knew the non-Indigenous community relatively well, but I didn't know the Indigenous people, either in the city or in the surrounding area. There were 2 solitudes. I wanted to make a bridge between those 2 solitudes. I felt a responsibility to find answers. I needed to outreach to the Indigenous community, but I really didn't know how to do that. Another judge, a colleague of mine, invited me to a sweat lodge ceremony. It was my first Indigenous ceremony. I didn't know what to expect, and quite frankly, I was a bit nervous going into the ceremony. And the elder, in a typical fashion, laughed and joked, and he knew that it was my first time. And he said, "Don't worry, David, I'm saving the hottest stones for judges. I always do." And he laughed, but I didn't. But I did think he did save those hot stones for me. It really made me sweat, but he inspired me, and I was inspired and confident enough to ask that elder for help. And he was gracious enough to give me some help. He wrote the name of a person and a phone number on the back of a matchbook cover. And he said to me, "Hey, when you get back to your home, make this call." I carried that matchbook cover with me for a week because I had to work up the courage, the guts to make that call. I finally did. I phoned out to a local First Nation in the area, and I explained on the call that I was the local judge. And the person on the other end of the phone said, oh, I know who you are. We've been waiting for your call for 100 years. And he meant it. This experience was an epiphany for me. It began my immersion in Cree culture and spirituality. That immersion taught me many things, the most profound of which was my education was incomplete. I needed to change what I accepted as true. I needed to be a critical thinker who was open to the knowledge of others. The wisdom and teaching of the elders helped fill in my education gap. People like Alma Kaitrahat, Kathy Lewis, Gladys Wapas, Alpha Lafon, and many, many more. They were kind, they were knowledgeable, very patient, and very willing to show me what I needed to know. At the treaty table in Saskatchewan, I had the privilege to meet and learn from many elders. This kind of education and interactions are no longer news in any way, because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission made it very clear to all of us that there were gaps in our understanding and knowledge, and we all have a duty to fill in those gaps through education. The Commission challenged us all to be better. It challenged us to reach out. During my days as Treaty Commissioner, elders and teachers came together to produce a set of resources for grades K to 12, classroom materials that explain the treaty relationship in a modern context. Speaking of treaties, I want to make a note of history here. Treaties were founded on written legal precedents created by the British and used by the Canadians. They were founded on, as well, and very importantly, the traditional knowledge, the oral history, and the long-standing principles created by First Nations, who were certainly not new to treaty making. I know many people here know these principles far better than I. I also know that there are many people here today who are on different places on their learning journey. For many, some of what I say will be entirely new, and some of what I say will be a reminder to others who already know this and know it better than I. For all of us, I believe, the ideas and principles that I describe are a helpful guide for the action that is needed in the calls to justice. I also do not want to create a burden for First Nations elders. However, my hope is that elders that are here today or in your communities can help you understand these important principles if you don't know them. These principles are wise, and in my belief, they should guide every policymaker in Canada, federal, provincial, or municipal. These principles can be found in the Treaty Elders book, which was created by Harold Cardinal and Walter Hildebrand for the exploratory treaty table in Saskatchewan. But this is a must-read for all teachers in Saskatchewan and in Canada. This book is available at McNally Robertson, locally here in Saskatoon. Mi'kmaq, the principle of getting along well with others. Good relations, expanding the circle. And I see this conference that's been created, We Rise, as expanding the circle. It's a demonstration of that principle in action. Wetaskiwin, living together on the land. Pimatuan, making a living. Topwewin, speaking the truth. I also refer people to the 16 common principles that underlie the treaty relationship, which is agreed to by Canada and the FSIN in 1998. Those principles are as good today as the day the treaties were entered into. And the First Nations principles and Canada agreed to those founding principles in treaty when they entered into the discussions to make the treaty. That book is a book of hope and history. It is also a reminder of our past and how the past has shaped the present. In 1763, King George III made a royal proclamation. He did that because he didn't want to have a large freestanding army in British North America, and there were many problems and disputes over land in the New England states in the United States. So the royal proclamation was a fundamental document that altered the history of Canada, because Canada, when it came west in the numbered treaties, used that model of British constitutional law to enter into the treaties. The proclamation is viewed by First Nations as the Magna Carta for Aboriginal rights because it protected the First Nations lands and it recognized Aboriginal peoples as nations. The fundamental problem is the treaty relationship did not find its rightful place in the Canadian state. The good intentions of the original treaty parties were replaced by the paternalistic policies inherent in the Indian Act regime, a regime founded on colonialism and patriarchy. Ironically, the Indian Act worked to take away the rights from First Nations people that the newcomers were in fact embracing. Some examples: it banned spiritual practices, led to the permit system, the pass system. It prohibited the right to legal counsel. It introduced residential schools and the abuse inherent in that system. In addition to all of that, the Indian Act was particularly discriminatory against Indigenous women. Under the Act, Indigenous women were subjected to loss of status, loss of property rights, and loss of a voice in governance. Failure to implement the treaty relationship according to the spirit and intent of treaty is one of the fundamental reasons that we're here today. This is our shared history, a history which must be broadly acknowledged and understood so that relationships can be repaired. During my tenure as Treaty Commissioner, we created teaching treaties in the classroom called We Are All Treaty People, a grades K to 12 pedagogy which is now mandatory in all Saskatchewan schools. This wasn't just for schools on reserves or schools that taught Indigenous studies, it was for all schools. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Racism came to Canada in 2004, and in March he made his final report to the United Nations, and he said that teaching material is a model for all of Canada, and he was right 17 years ago. It's for all students everywhere because all children must learn the importance of treaty. They must know about the history of First Nations people and understand all sides of the story. They are owed an honest assessment of what went right, what went wrong, and why we are in a situation that we find ourselves here today, here at We Rise, helping to shape an action plan on the calls for justice. Racism is a huge problem in Saskatchewan. It is deeply woven into the fabric of society. An Environics poll in 2016 found that Saskatchewan was #1 on racism against Indigenous people. In this province, racism is a social norm. In this province, gender discrimination is a social norm. Both are systemic and destructive. We live in a province where discrimination against Indigenous peoples is a harsh reality, where the Indigenous population is overrepresented in our prisons, where Indigenous women and girls are disproportionately more vulnerable to socioeconomic marginalization than non-Indigenous women and girls, where Indigenous women and girls are more vulnerable to violence than non-Indigenous counterparts, where a disproportionate number of Indigenous women and girls are missing and murdered. We all know that is unacceptable. I want to quote directly from the inquiry report. We must address and remedy the deliberate, persistent human and Indigenous rights violations and abuses that are at the root cause behind Canada's staggering rates of violence against Indigenous women and girls. In addition to the 231 calls for justice recommended in the report, I believe we need an ongoing mechanism to ensure governments at all levels take their rightful responsibilities. We also need to establish equity. We need to work for inclusion. Why do we need that? Because we need harmony in our society. How is harmony generated? It comes from respect. How is respect created? It comes from empathy. How is empathy created? It comes from understanding. How is understanding created? It comes from knowledge. Knowledge is created by education. Education is the foundation for what we so desperately need in our society, harmony. Education is vital. In schools today, education focuses on training for a job, a vocation, through numeracy and literacy. The old 3 R's of educating, reading, writing, and arithmetic need to have more foundations. We need to add a social component. We need to teach students citizenship education. Citizenship education recognizes the new 3 R's: rights, responsibility, and respect. Citizenship education resources are required for grades K to 12 that answer these questions. What does it mean to be a citizen? What are the rights of citizenship? Equally important, what are the responsibilities that accompany those rights? And how do we build and maintain respect for every citizen, no exceptions? Why? Because every woman, every girl is a human being. Every woman, every girl, every single human being deserves equal moral consideration. Education is the foundation for harmony and the respect we need in society. It is imperative to strengthen that foundation. We cannot be passive about creating and sustaining good citizenship. We need to intentionally and explicitly teach the responsibilities of citizenship every day in some way in every school from grades K to 12. When I talk about the responsibilities of citizenship, I think of these responsibilities. They're not exclusive. First, to know and understand the rights of citizenship so you don't knowingly transgress the rights of others. We all have a responsibility to see the treaty relationship implemented according to the spirit and intent of treaty. A responsibility to reconcile with Indigenous people. A responsibility to make the world a better place. A responsibility to respect our fellow citizens. No bullying, no racism, no discrimination, no exceptions. Now, I'm pleased to tell you that these resources exist and that they are working and doing all the things I've just described. This is work of the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission and the Consentus Citizenship Education Foundation. In partnership with teachers, educators, and administrators, K-12 resources were created with the help of many, including the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. These resources are specific to the Saskatchewan curriculum and are currently being used in classrooms throughout the province. In addition to teaching the new 3 R's, rights, responsibility, and respect, these resources are designed to instill in all students 5 essential competencies of citizenship. All citizens are to be enlightened, empowered, and empathetic, ethical, and engaged. In addition to these resources, we have a strong emphasis on Indigenous governance and culture. Teaching treaties in the classroom, we're all treaty people, is embedded in these resources. Students are taught about the residential school experience. Students are encouraged to explore the relationship between human rights, treaty rights, and Indigenous rights. With a solid foundation in the 5 E's and the 3 R's, along with a better understanding of our shared history, students will become engaged and understanding citizens. Imagine a new generation of citizens eager to learn about social problems, brave enough to declare their moral imperatives, courageous enough to have conversations that matter, informed enough to understand and tackle complex issues. Issues like the underlying social, economic, cultural, institutional, and historical causes that contribute to the systemic discrimination and the ongoing violence against women and girls. Change. I want to talk about change in these terms. The challenges facing Indigenous people in Canada represents the most pressing human rights issue in this country. It's time to stand up, speak out, and address these issues. It's time for change, time for action. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission carefully assembled 94 clear calls to action. If those actions are taken, we will change the lives of Indigenous people who have been affected by the residential school system. The National Inquiry into Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls recommended 231 calls for justice, actions that need to be taken to transform systemic and societal values that continue to perpetuate violence against Indigenous women and girls. We must heed these calls for justice. We must act. That is why we're here today, here to advocate for a better Canada, to reflect on what has been accomplished, and to find ways to move forward to heal the relationship between Indigenous people and other Canadians. Some people believe that relationship is too broken to be repaired. I do not agree. I believe that people of goodwill, working in common purpose, can make a difference. I also believe as a province and as a country, we have an opportunity to rebuild relationships, make them stronger, and create a transformative, lasting change. Why? Because the interconnected relationship between human rights, Indigenous rights, and treaty rights is now beginning to be much more fully understood. Human rights, Indigenous rights, and treaty rights are about fairness, recognitions of one's inherent dignity and individuality, and they are about respect. A society demonstrates respect for the rights of all people by promoting equality, equity, and diversity. As a society, we've come a long way, but there's still much work to do, as we all know, in order to ensure a brighter future for ourselves, our children, and our children's children. We all share a responsibility. For its part, the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission has an important role to play in this province's future. The Commission is mandated to promote and protect and educate the public about human rights. It is bound by legislation to pursue equality, equity, and dignity for every person in this province without exception. The Commission pursues its mandate using problem-solving approaches with the aim of restorative justice. That restorative justice is a fundamental principle underlying our mediation process. This is widely used in Indigenous communities in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. It's been borrowed from those communities, those cultures. The Commission uses mediation and it seeks to resolve matters and to restore and maintain harmony in a situation, in the relationships that are broken before us. Best case outcomes include community building and mutual understanding. The goal is to repair a broken relationship or keep a relationship of community unbroken. Along with mediation, the Commission embraced the use of systemic advocacy. Systemic advocacy is designed to address discrimination and inequality and inequity that affects a group of people, a large cohort of individuals. I mention systemic advocacy as well as mediation because both pathways to resolution demonstrate the importance of collaboration and fostering mutual understanding, which is so important to the work that you're undertaking. Collaboration and mutual understanding are necessary if we're to address and eradicate the issues affecting the lives of Indigenous women and girls. It is well documented that Indigenous women and girls persistently and disproportionately experience physical and sexual violence. It is well documented that 1, violence, fewer employment opportunities, 3, negative outcomes related to the social determinants of health explain in part some of the factors that create mental health and addictions issues, lead to criminalization, and contribute to significant social inequality for Indigenous women. Attaining social equity for Indigenous women is one of the main goals of this conference. To achieve it, recognition of individual and collective human rights is required. These rights must be upheld, protected, and promoted so that Indigenous women and girls may reclaim their power and their rightful place in society. It also requires each and every person to act responsibly and accountably. We all belong to one human family. That comes from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the world's response to the Holocaust. One human family is in the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code. As members of one human family, it is our shared responsibility to create a safe and respectful environment for everyone, especially Indigenous women and girls, whom society has failed. So how do we go about doing this? I don't have all the answers. What I do know is that we need to take action. And each of us can take practical steps toward action. By denouncing and speaking out against the epidemic of violence that Indigenous women and girls face in this country. By learning about our shared history and educating people about it. By being an ally that amplifies the voices of survivors and families. By reading the inquiry's final report. By being an advocate for citizenship education. And by asking governments to uphold and act on the calls for justice. Tomorrow you'll hear from my friend and colleague Judge Buller. She'll be speaking about the Yukon's action plan. That strategy is a significant step because it's a joint strategy involving First Nations government, municipal government, territorial government, and the federal government. And it details how the Yukon Territory will move forward on this issue in the next 10 to 15 years. I challenge everybody here at this conference to act respectfully and responsibly and to take the lead, to fill the vacuum, and to ask governments to follow suit. I believe that First Nations women and their allies, who are all present today, the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission, the Office of the Treaty Commission, and also all individuals, Indigenous, non-individuals, and organizations who are represented here today. Because together we can make, you can make a powerful force that cannot be denied. All Saskatchewan people have a vested interest in the success of an action plan in the calls for justice. I believe that your leadership on this issue will resonate with all women in Canada. The outcomes and actions of this conference will make a valuable contribution to Canadian society. At the beginning of this presentation, I said that I had hope. Hope that we can achieve a future where hurting and murdering women is not seen as okay, not someone else's problem. Hope for a better future that embraces the TRC's call to action. Hope for a future that implements the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report calls for justice. Hope for a future that embraces a human rights pathway. Hope for a better partnership, a better relationship, a better future. Hope that is buoyed by education, by your leadership, and by the action plan for change. The hope that I'm talking about is here with us today because it is in each of you. Ultimately, the hope that I have is in your heart and in your hands. Thank you very much.